I'm Tim Constantine. I write for the Washington Times. I also host a program called The Capitol Hill Show that airs here in the United States and also broadcasts in 119 countries around the globe. I have traveled quite a bit through the region. I've been in some wonderfully fun and relaxing places like Qatar and Oman. I have been in less relaxing places like Syria and Iraq and several other places along the way. So I've been privileged the last few years to serve on the advisory board for the Gulf International Forum, and I appreciate the opportunity to work with this esteemed panel today. The media landscape in the Middle East faces a lot of challenges. And that can be anything from censorship to the spread of disinformation. Also, right now is a great example of this. The news can be manipulated to try to impact people's thoughts during time of conflict. Journalists and media outlets often operate under tight scrutiny in the region with limited ability to report on sensitive items freely. Sometimes they cannot report everything that they see and feel comfortable or safe doing so. These challenges, of course, have created an environment where independent reporting struggles to thrive. That gives rise to alternative narratives and media platforms through social media and through artificial intelligence content. At the same time, in their quest for global and regional influence, the Gulf states have increased their investment and roles in different media platforms. The world of communication is changing dramatically. The use of media, social media, and artificial intelligence in the Gulf grew in the last decade with an emphasis on soft power and ventures linked to those fields, the fields of social media and so on. Social media platforms and AI technologies continue to evolve, and they're reshaping the way that Gulf states project their influence, both regionally and globally. These tools have become a good challenge, shall we say, to some of the mainstream media narratives, enabling Gulf nations to assert their perspective on global issues more effectively. By leveraging AI-driven content creation and social media outreach, Gulf states are not only enhancing their soft power, but also competing in the rapidly shifting landscape of global information. We have 4 panelists that are experts in this category today. We are going to do 2 rounds of prepared questions, a question for each panelist, a second question for each panelist. Those answers will be 4 minutes. They've made me swear that I will keep you on schedule, so we'll see how that goes, but try to stay on 4 minutes for those, and we'll work from there. Our panelists, starting at the far end, Khaled Almaeena, former editor-in-chief of Arab News and the Saudi Gazzette. He's a managing partner in Quartz Communication and chairman of the Arab Business Media Group. Batrawy is the NPR international correspondent based out of Dubai. Ryan Grimm is the co-founder of Dropsite News, and he is also the host of the podcast Deconstructed. Great name. And Dr. Marc Owen Jones is an assistant professor in the Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Also has a great book out on this very topic that we are discussing today. Marc, welcome. Khaled, let's start with you. The first question is, how would you assess the performance of Arab media over the past year? And what are the key challenges that it faces? And are there certain areas that you would recommend for improvement?
The state of the Arab media is like the state of the Arab world. And it's something that we have to look at, and at every stage of or every decade you have to review it. Right now, I think we are facing many challenges, since you spoke about challenges, and you did outline some of the negative features of what's happening on. But I truly believe that with the advent of the technology, the AI and other things, if we are able to come to grips with what's going on, we will be able to go ahead. yes, there has been progress in getting new machines and getting state-of-the-art technology, but the media is not about art, the state-of-the-art technology. The media is all about content. And if there is no conducive atmosphere to get content that is appealing to the new generation, whose needs are different, who want something new, who want something out of the box, then I think it will still regress and go back again. It hasn't kept up because still the demographic of the columnists with flowery language, some people living in the past, the breakdown of the big media houses, all these have contributed to a sort of stalemate in progress. At the same time, AI, the artificial intelligence has come in. It's been challenging. It's causing problems to those who are in the past and who want to regress and go back. Again, new technology has brought in more freedom. So you have a Prague Spring as far as the media is concerned. People can write whatever they do and all. But this also brings in another danger of fake news. Now, it may not be prevalent in the West, but outside the West, in our region, all kinds of news and everything else is going on in leaps and bounds, and it's causing a lot of problems. At the same time, many of the journalists in our part of the world have become political pundits, they have become analysts, and people who have unfortunately no knowledge, no intellectual depth, have suddenly styled themselves as people who know everything. So these are some of the issues that are of concern to me. Now, I'm not old school thought. I think we should progress. I think people should come in, but at the same time, the atmosphere of openness, talking frankly, investigative reporting, getting facts on the ground are very necessary for us to go ahead. Without it, I think we will still be in that stage where we were when the paper was print and the radio was the main source of news.
Thank you very much. Friendly and investigative reporting, things that I miss in the media. Aya, what challenges do you face based out of the Gulf when you're reporting Gulf news to an American audience and there's misinformation or there's pieces that are selectively used? What are the toughest challenges you face in trying to make sure you get accurate information out?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this. I would say, so I've been based in the Gulf for 10 years and in the Middle East for a bit longer than that as well. And, let me start with what it's like to be in the Gulf. When I first arrived from Cairo, where I had been based with the Associated Press, the first thing I asked people is, what shows do you watch at night? What talk shows, what conversational shows? And I was told there aren't any in the UAE. And so I had to search until I found a show by Dawood al-Sharian, a Saudi TV presenter, and he had an incredible show that would tackle social issues. For example, teachers would talk about wages. There was an Egyptian woman who married a Saudi man whose daughter was beaten to death by the father and sexually abused, and he brought the mother to talk about the blood money she was forced to take. So it was really interesting. It really went deep into the social fabric. That show has since been canceled. So the first thing is just finding out what is actually happening in the Gulf, below the surface. And I think it's really a disservice to people in the Gulf that there is not a platform to discuss these issues honestly. There are ways, of course, within the Gulf. There's majlises and there's private ways to raise your concerns and your needs, but it's very limited. I think another issue when it comes to misinformation is lack of access and transparency to Gulf officials when you need to ask them about certain policies or certain rumors or certain stories that come up. There's no spokesperson to call at the foreign ministry. There are very few background briefings to sort of let you in on the thinking and the rationale and the strategy, few and far between. So that also adds another challenge because there's an expectation that you should know. And oftentimes I do, but it would be helpful if there were actually, people to turn to in the government to have those conversations and say, why is this your policy right now? I also think, on Twitter, and I'm sure Marc can talk about this in detail, I used to be able to, as a journalist, turn to Twitter to see where the temperature of things. And those hashtags now either don't exist, or they've been hijacked by bots and pro-government accounts that aren't really real people. They just have these pictures of the rulers and things like that. And this is across the Gulf, every country, okay? I think that, and I think that another thing too I would say is the Gulf is not homogenous, as we all know. And even within each country, there's a diversity of opinion. In the bigger countries, I say in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait, it's not homogenous. There are a lot of different views and backgrounds, more so than maybe in smaller countries like Qatar and the UAE. But again, the Gulf is just not homogenous. And so as a journalist reporting for the American press, I don't like to say sweeping statements like, well, the Gulf, has these tensions with Iran. The Gulf doesn't have, Oman doesn't have it, Qatar doesn't have it, Kuwait ebbs and flows. It's not consistently the same. And so I think, just falling into those traps of language just to make things simpler, it doesn't work. The oversimplification is a disservice to the audience. And then I think lastly, one of the biggest challenges is just the fear people have of speaking openly about what's happening. There's been a tremendous crackdown since the Arab Spring across the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf. And everyone is expected to fall in lockstep. And I think a lot of people do trust in their leadership, and that's fine. We'd love to hear those voices too, but not everybody on every issue.
Right.
So those are some of the challenges.
Fair enough, thank you. As I said, we'll do 2 rounds of prepared questions, but then we're going to do a 3rd round with questions from you. So if you think of things along the way, jot down notes, and if you pass it to our staff, then they'll bring it to me, and when we get to the 3rd round, I'll be happy to ask questions from the audience of our folks as well. So anything you think of, please write it down. Ryan, what role do alternative media outlets, you're doing it, firsthand, but what role do alternative media outlets play compared to mainstream media?
In some ways, we play a similar role to mainstream media, because, and I think the point that Aya made is really worth underlining, that a free media in an unfree society is in conflict, and it's difficult for the free media to then produce anything accurate, because people are not being honest with reporters because they're nervous about who's listening or what they're allowed to say. If some of the journalists who are most in the know don't always necessarily know what the government policy is, then the public most certainly doesn't necessarily know and doesn't want to even accidentally step out of line. And so that makes any kind of free press, whether it's mainstream or alternative, feel subversive to the people who are trying to control it. The alternative press probably feels a little extra subversive, but not much. But I think genuinely not much more so. So until there is a little bit more opening when it comes to the ability of all journalists to do reporting, I think everybody's going to be seen as kind of alternative media. Now, what we can do that some of the other outlets can't necessarily put the resources behind is, long-term investigations, because nobody expects us to be, over at Dropsite News, to be covering every incremental development the way that they expect that of a major news outlet like the New York Times or NPR or somebody else. So that means that we can, even though we have a much smaller set of resources, we can put basically all of those resources into deeper stories and going after sources who are willing to take the risks to talk.
What's interesting is we're talking obviously about communication in the Gulf region, but even in the United States, the Gallup organization does a poll, and they ask the same questions year after year after year, so you can measure the attitudes of the public 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago against the same things that we look and see now. And they asked in this year's, and this just came out maybe 10 days ago, they asked this year, what is your trust level? This is in the United States. What's your trust level with media? And it was 2 out of 3. It was 68% of the people either had no trust that they were getting an accurate picture or very little trust. That's almost 7 out of 10 people, even in the United States, don't believe the media. And that's a problem. You know, that's a problem anywhere on the globe. And so when we talk, I want to be very careful when we talk about some of the challenges in the Gulf, that we realize there are challenges all over the world to make sure we're getting accurate information out to people. Marc, let's talk about social media and how is it leveraged when we talk about disinformation and people that you know, information that is not accurate getting out. How is social media being leveraged not only in the Gulf but all around the world?
Yes, thanks, and thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. So yes, disinformation as distinct from misinformation, just to clarify, obviously disinformation is usually deliberately harmful, false information as opposed to accidentally false. But I will say this, is that some people, the World Economic Forum has argued that AI-driven disinformation is going to be one of the biggest threats to humanity in the coming years, so it is perceived as a large problem. And I think disinformation has always been around, whether it's in legacy media, alternative media, and on social media. The difference now, obviously, with digital technology and later AI, is the entry costs have been lowered into the production of that information. And social media is a particularly important example of that. And also, people are increasingly consuming news and information through social media, so potential exposure to disinformation is also increasing. And I think when people think about disinformation, I've heard several things today, and it's quite interesting. I think some people mentioned that it's something we associate with this region, but not in the US, which surprised me, actually, because I think of disinformation as a very much a European, American thing, because this terminology has actually been used a lot recently, especially after Brexit and with the elections. What people tend to talk about, though, is often Russia, China, Iran, right? When you hear disinformation, you hear Russia, China, and Iran in those kind of same breaths. And whilst we don't know, and it's very hard to quantify, for example, who are the biggest spreaders of disinformation, whether it's individuals or countries, the Middle East region gets neglected. And one of the few ways, when I was writing my book, of trying to quantify, for example, how can we determine who's a big actor in the disinformation space, I went to Twitter before it was taken over by the person whose name we can't mention, not Voldemort, Elon Musk. Twitter had a brief period of transparency, and I say this because I was very critical of Twitter before Musk took over. I'll be clear about that. But they used to publish, for example, lists of fake accounts, or Twitter accounts that had been connected to state-backed influence operations, often disinformation campaigns. So you could actually go on the website, and over the period of a few years, maybe 3, you could actually download all the Excel files. So I downloaded all the files, and I basically collated to see which states, according to Twitter, had the most accounts connected to state-backed influence operations. And number 1, I often ask my students to guess what they think that was. People say different things, but number 1 is China. We don't have time to make you guess. China, which fits in with the narratives we heard. But number 2 was actually the combined Saudi, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. Now, I think Bahrain was thrown in there because it's pretty small. But it shows the importance of this information in the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf as a space. But what it also showed was something else very interesting. Iran was on that list. You had other countries, Serbia, Indonesia. But, for example, the US and Israel weren't on the list. And that's not because they weren't engaged in disinformation, 100%, right? And this is a point I wanted to raise about disinformation. It's also become politicized. So when we talk about the global impact of disinformation, we have to be clear when we talk about disinformation. We can't just talk about disinformation as a problem from Russia, China, or even the Middle East, right? Disinformation is a universal problem, and we have to accept as well that just because some information might not be convenient to, for example, foreign policy, it doesn't make it not disinformation. And I think this has been really clear since October the 7th of how, for example, many narratives we've seen coming out of Israel aren't framed as disinformation. They are framed as, reporting another side of a debate or a contested kind of narrative and not false news. And just to end with an example, when we saw allegations of Russian interference in the previous US elections, this made a lot of news. it was a huge thing. We had inquiries in the US into the Russian role in interfering in US elections. But earlier this year, I worked on an investigation where I identified a large social media network that was targeting mainly African-American congressmen in the US. It was also spreading anti-Muslim and anti-Arab propaganda in Canada and North America. And this was later then tied to a Tel Aviv-based PR firm contracted by the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs in Israel to spread this hate speech. But it was never really called a disinformation campaign, or it didn't achieve that same level of criticism that it would have been had it been, for example, say a Russian or Chinese one. So I think when we talk about disinformation globally, we need to be fair. We need to say it doesn't matter whoever's spreading it, whether they're allies, there are enemies. It needs to be called disinformation.
Just a reminder, we'll do round 2 now of the prepared questions, but if you think of questions, we would really enjoy having your input as well. So please jot them down, and when we get to round 3, they will be your questions. Khaled, do you think Arab media remains a reliable source of information for the public? And how has the shift from what we call traditional media to social media, how has that impacted Arab youth engagement with news and information?
Well, I think before I answered that, there was this thing about communication. You have to understand why many of the young Arabs or the Arabs don't speak when, let's use the word accosted by a Western media guy, because A, the Arab world is a tribal society, it's a tribal society, and B, it's a patriarchal society. So many of my friends from the Western media come and ask me, we went to this young man and I asked, he says, I don't know. Either they are ignorant about the issue, or they fake it, or they want somebody elder to them because they will feel more comfortable somebody else taking any blame if something wrong happens. I think young people now have entered the foray. I said the thing that the positive aspect is that technology is free. It's become much cheaper, so you have more and more impact of young people and into TikTok, into other issues coming in. So I think but what is needed more is, as I said before, the content, whether we have the real programs that appeal to people, like you said, that Dawood Shirayan show, we do lack that. And I think it's very important to have podcasts and important for us to have programs on the YouTube that appeal. A lot of the clips that we see about Gaza, we see from Western sources, from young Americans and of all nationalities, coming and talking about it. So I think the Arab youth are going in, but there is, a step-by-step approach for them not to offend anyone. Before it was the religious groups that, one had to be careful of, but that's the thing of the past. But I do believe that with the almost demise of the paper and the falling of the big media houses, every cowboy can get his own media service and present it. This is more truthful, this has more accuracy, and people know. But then there's also a danger, because some people have misused it, much to the anger of the authorities. And there are many examples. If you notice in September, when the Rwandan kids killed 3 English girls, and Tommy Robinson in Cyprus said they are Muslims, a Muslim killed without mentioning, there were riots. So this is what the governments in the Arab states are afraid of, this new media, that it might cause turmoil, it might cause somebody to incite against them, especially in the light of what happened a few years ago in the Arab Spring. So, they are being careful and watching, but young people are going up by leaps and bounds, and they don't care about these issues, and they have their own podcasts. You have podcasts and programs that are viewed by millions of people. They're not registered, they don't have a license, they would put their website outside the area. So I think there's been a great improvement in this aspect.
Thank you. It was interesting, we think about traditional media and we think about social media, and I think in the West anyway, when we think in terms of youth engagement, I always think there's more control. If you have social media, regardless of what it is, you can kind of filter down and pick and choose the content you want to see. Whereas if you're watching CNN, you are a passive participant. You are taking whatever is fed to you by them. You have no control whether you want to see that or not. And I work in DC, but my home is in Florida, and I commute back and forth. And when I fly, I have two televisions in front of me. And one I tend to put on CNN, and one I put on Fox News. And it's always fascinating because you get very different stories within the United States from these two news sources. But, and usually I have music on in my ears, and it's only when a good story pops up do I then actually tune in to what's on the television. But there was one trip during the last year of the Trump presidency, and on CNN, I caught, they did some story that how bad Donald Trump was. And then they did another story on how bad Donald Trump was. And then they did a third story, and they were different topics, but every one of them, the theme was President Trump was a horrible guy. And so I was fascinated by this, so I watched the entire hour, and at 57 past the hour, they did a story on dogs. Had nothing to do with politics. But for 57 minutes, it was beat up Donald Trump. And I said, you can like Donald Trump or not like Donald Trump. That isn't the point. I just thought, at the rate that they were reporting, if Donald Trump cured cancer, they would say Trump puts doctors out of work. Because it was just, their entire shtick was selling to people who did not like Trump. It wasn't about reporting news. Because, first of all, I don't know that everything he did was bad, but I also don't think that all the news was about Donald Trump. You know, there are other things going on in the world. And so it's fascinating. I think that one of the great aspects with social media is people can tune that part out. They can control and seek out the information and topics that is of interest to them. I think that's one of the control factors with
and
you.
they can rectify some of the errors or the forced errors made by the TV. You know, sometimes if something happens, as you said, CNN, I don't want to go in that old adage saying of the Western media, because a lot of support has come from the West, the NGOs and others for the people of Gaza, but then you can correct it and you can sort of write fake and non-fake and stuff like that. And this was very well explained in so many of the incidents that happened, especially with the rise of Islamophobia in the West. People corrected it, and even people from the West, you know, said that this is wrong. So I agree with you. Too much overdose of Trump or of any other thing is a bit not good for the health.
Hey, I've been in and out of the region several times in the past year, and the stories I see when I'm in the region on any of the networks, could be Saudi television, could be Omani television, could be Egyptian television, could be Al Jazeera. The stories are very different than the stories I see when I'm here in the United States on CNN or Fox News or any of the others. So what challenges do you face as a journalist in the region, particularly during this last year? With the war raging and two very different perspectives, what are the biggest challenges you face in getting that accurate story out?
So for the past year, as a journalist based in the Middle East, I've, you know, the biggest and most important and consequential story has been the war in Gaza. And so it doesn't matter where you are in the region, that is all hands on deck. Everyone has to contribute, and it's, you know, where you put your resources and time, because so many lives are at stake, and, you know, America's involvement is very entrenched. So I find the first challenge is finding the language to describe what we've been seeing over the past year. I often find that the words fail me. And so I find that to be very challenging. I also find it challenging to weigh, you know, how much to bring to the audience, because do you want to air the call of the woman under the rubble? You have to really consider what we're doing. What's the purpose of our, you know, what we are writing and scripting, what images show or not show. You know, you don't want to sanitize a war. You also don't want to just show bad images just to show them. I also worry about, you know, you start to become numb if you see a lot of these images. They don't shock you the way that they might So I find those are just the basic challenges, and I think that would apply to, people anywhere covering something like this, although I don't think that there is something quite like this. I also think the scrutiny of the story can be challenging at times, but I do think it makes the journalism better, because you really, really need to weigh and think about every single word that you choose to say and not say. And so I can, as a journalist, I read other journalists' work, and I can see from them what they choose to say and what they don't choose to say. And so I think, just the scrutiny, what's at stake in this war. Also, just being able to convey to the American audiences the sentiment in the region has been challenging. I can't quite explain to people how much ground the U.S. has lost when it comes to any kind of moral standing or standing when it comes to issues of human rights and democracy. I spent some time in Cairo at the start of this war, and I was speaking to very brave journalists who are facing prosecution for their journalism and who are, facing prison for their advocacy, and people who may have turned to the U.S. to advocate their causes told me, we would never want that now. We don't want it. We don't want to be used as some kind of pawn or something. That's how they see it. And so I think just explaining and just bringing that to the American audience is just really how the sentiment is viewed, even among, whether it's liberals or conservatives in the region, whether it's young, brave journalists, or whether it's, just the average person. It's difficult to convey, I think, just how much has changed in this past year and the generations that it could take, just generations.
Right.
I think we'll be dealing with the consequences of this for a very, very long time.
Now would be the time, if you're going to have questions, jot them down, hand them off, because we've got 2 more questions, and then we want to go to your questions if we can. Ryan, what unique challenges do the new platforms, the social media platforms, face, particularly in terms of long-term sustainability? It's easy right now. You may see a headline or you may see something on Twitter that you click on, but how do you build a following? How do you become a credible source in these social media platforms?
So we were lucky in the sense that we already had built-in followings over a couple decades of work, and also we had been, and this turned out to be extraordinarily important, we had been building basically an email list for 7, 8, 9 years. Maybe you're on it. And so we had several 100,000 emails of people that we knew were interested in our work when we launched. And so we were able to then go directly to their inbox, which is susceptible to some forms of algorithms. The Gmail spam filter, other email service providers have different vicissitudes, but it's the least susceptible to an algorithm of any other medium. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, all of them have really abandoned the original idea, which was people would consciously and actively choose to follow a journalist or an influencer or some type of content creator, and then the platform would deliver them the content from the person that they had followed. The YouTube and others have now been explicit about the fact that they have abandoned that link, that they analyze your behavior around the internet. They follow you all over the internet. They figure out what you actually like, and they distinguish that from what you tell them that you like, because their theory is that we have a kind of higher opinion of ourselves than we deserve, and that we might say that we want this important educational, informational content, but if they feed us garbage, we are more likely to consume that for longer stretches of time. If they feed us stuff that makes us angry, that we're likely to engage with that and share it, and get even angrier and continue. So that the pipes have also and that I think has broken the pipes in a significant way for new journalism outfits. I haven't been timing, but you can cut me off whenever you want. So that if we had gone into this fresh without any following, I think we would be enormously struggling to be able to get enough people who are willing to subscribe and pay for pay for the journalism.
Right.
People are willing to pay, but you have to build that audience first. And it's extraordinary. It would be extraordinarily difficult without a built-in audience. And it's also difficult. It's going to take a long time to scale. Like, we can build a news organization of 10 to 15 people in the first year or so, but that's a tiny fraction
Right.
of what a major media outlet has.
Marc, we've established that both misinformation and disinformation do occur.
A little bit.
What role is AI playing in amplifying the spread of false information?
Okay, firstly, when we talk about AI and disinformation or misinformation, people often default to things like generative tools. Can we, create fake text easily with ChatGPT, or create fake images, with Dolly or, Midjourney? Yes, we can. But often people see the threat from AI and social media as being able to imitate something real, right? You could fake someone's voice, as we've seen. You could, recently, for example, Bella Hadid had a video of her that was deep-faked where she was saying something that she didn't. Joe Biden's voice, I think, was deep-faked, and there was audio calls going around. These are uses of AI that can be problematic. But if you look at, for example, images of AI used on social media in disinformation or propaganda, a lot of it isn't designed to fool. It's not designed to mislead necessarily. For example, traditional propaganda would have been posters. Propaganda posters were not meant to be photographs, right? And so the same thing is true of AI-generated images. You can just create effective or powerful images that are, accompany disinformation and propaganda a lot more easily than you could before, right? So in theory, again, like social media lowered the bar to entry, lowered the cost to entry for people to become content creators or create disinformation, AI is similarly lowering the cost. And there have already been a number of campaigns that have been identified in which AI is being used to generate the text, right? The one I mentioned earlier is one example. So yes, AI is facilitating that process. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think AI is, at this point, as dangerous as people have made out to be. That's not to say that I don't think it will be. But I think it's really important when we're talking about mis and disinformation is that things don't have to be sophisticated to fool people, right? This is a key, right? So you don't need a sophisticated image to make someone believe something not to be true, right? And this is often the problem when we have these issues of polarization. People will believe what they want to believe, okay? And we saw this recently, for example, the awful bombing in northern Gaza, where it was a horrible image of a burning young man. And some people just dismissed it, that it was faked and it wasn't real, because they didn't want to accept that. And this happens to anyone across any political divide, right? So no amount of manipulating that image or anything would necessarily change the person's mind if they already held a particular belief. On the other hand, I think the worrying thing from AI comes from, and Ryan touched on this with things like algorithms. AI isn't just about generating images and generating text, AI is also going to increase the sophistication of how algorithms learn about our behavior, learn about what kind of information we like and don't like, and is disseminated. And the great example here was just the fact that we get served information that we know will increase our engagement, right? We get put information that we know we liked. During COVID, for example, people were given videos, conspiracy videos. They'd watch a conspiracy video. They were given another conspiracy video because that's what the algorithm dictated they liked, right? And that's because of monetization. It's tied to obviously the issue of money, right? If you spend more time on a particular platform, they're going to make more money, right? And so there's this issue, and it's the lack of transparency about things like algorithm and AI, and how much of this AI training and the AI models used to actually influence behavior is what scares me a lot, right? And we can see the fake images being generated, but we don't always know what's actually going on behind the scenes. You know, there's an organization called the Algorithmic Justice League, which is about trying to basically force companies to shed more light on what their algorithms do, because the algorithms are curating the information that we consume. And that should be, in my opinion, information that we as the public are entitled to. And the reason I say this, partly, is because so many social media companies, chief among them X, like to position themselves as these arenas of free speech, right? And the public sphere. And I was like, well, how can a private company be a public sphere, right? Unless you're showing some level of commitment to transparency, to the public good, you cannot claim that you're part of this public debate. So I think that, to me, is the biggest issue, is the lack of transparency about often how AI is used in dissemination of information, particularly when it comes to social media platforms.
To your final point, when at the Washington Times, we can track, and virtually anyone in media does this, but we can track in real time. If we publish a story online, then we can track how many people are reading that story this very minute. We can see how long they stay on there. If it's a short visit, you know they bailed out after a couple of paragraphs. But we can tell how many people, and you can see what stories take off, what stories go viral, not just by the count, but you can do it in real time and how quickly those stories are absorbed. But what was interesting is over the last couple of years, and this gets to your point with AI, and those are not truly public entities, and there were certain topics where the quantity would be governed. If you had a story that was viral and took off and you had 10,000 views in a matter of minutes, it would then squelch right down and slow down like that. If you had a similar story that took 24 hours to get 10,000 views because it was just puttering along, it would still squelch. It would squeeze down when you got to a certain quantity. There were clearly algorithms that were controlling how far certain topics would go. And that's very disturbing that you've got private companies that are making those decisions as to what you might see, because you know that we've decided that topic shouldn't go beyond a certain number of viewers. So it isn't always the same topics you would think either. Some of them are odd topics, but it's a very, very concerning side, and I appreciate you bringing that part of it up. It's not just what we read, sometimes it's what we don't get to read. All right, we're going to go to the audience questions. Khaled, can news outlets like the BBC or CNN or Sky News or any of these major networks, can they, and if so, how can they be held accountable if they share information that either intentionally or unintentionally turns out to be false? How can they be held accountable? There is no governing body on the world stage.
Well, I mean, the recent example was in Gaza when Sarah Seidner said she saw babies being beheaded and all, and later it turned out that it was a press release from the IDF, and I had tweeted about it, and I asked CNN to remove this woman, or this young lady, from her job because it caused a lot of chaos, and especially in Europe and all, where they described the Palestinians as cutthroats and butchers and all, and then later on the New York Times took it. So it's difficult. Lawsuits don't help. It's a very long and tedious process, very difficult. The moral responsibility lies on the producers and all, but you're right. I mean, any errant editor can get away, and I think the only way you could do it is by countering it through social media, and people did, by the way. Norman Finkelstein attacked Sarah Seidner, or he set it straight and said all the Palestinians who had left their homes on that day went to attack or to fight or to whatever it is, knew they were not coming back. So they didn't go down there to rape or behead babies. But it came from the social media and from someone who was respected in the social media. And he did say, I'm the grandson of a Holocaust survivor and all. So you can't fight, you can't beat City Hall, as they say. So the only way you could do it is through usage of social media.
Thank you. You talked about some of the challenges you face in the region and people being fearful of sharing certain information. How do you overcome either the lack of sources, if people just, in the media, when the government entities do not want to meet, or fear among your sources and not wanting to share? How do you overcome that as a journalist?
So I don't think that you do overcome it. If people aren't willing to go on record and speak example, their thoughts about, it could be something domestic, like higher gas prices or something. It doesn't even have to be something very charged politically. Or if they're unhappy with, some subsidies being removed or something. It's very difficult to overcome that. You kind of have to just really be one step ahead of things. And I think, here's the thing, like you can find something maybe on Twitter, maybe, or X now. You can, see maybe the propaganda that's coming in support of that, how strong it is and what it's saying to sort of understand what the flip side of that might be. There's just different ways. You can also, you've been in the region long enough, you tend to sort of know certain countries and, how much dissent there might be. Like I was saying, some countries have maybe slightly more dissent than others in the society. But generally, it's very, very hard. I think an example of that was when the UAE did sign the Abraham Accords under Trump. It was very, very difficult to really know what people thought. I'd heard from people that not everyone was supportive, but I didn't see it. It was just, we saw a lot of support for it everywhere we went, and so it was difficult to sort of really say definitively how people felt. I just really couldn't gauge, the response. And so there are times when you really just can't overcome it, and you just have to sort of take your time and just report what you're seeing. But I would just also say that, when it comes to the Gulf, and when it comes to trying to overcome this fear of sources, you also don't want to expose your sources or your people to unnecessary harm.
Right.
There's people I just can't call anymore because I know their phones are tapped. I can't visit them or ask to visit them because I don't want to bring them harm. Speaking to journalists can be part of the charge sheet, And so I also it's not just about the story, it's also about the safety of people, and you have to respect that as a journalist and really be mindful of that.
Do you fear, does it run through your mind at times, because of the challenges you face, when you publish, that it's incomplete? Do you think, God, I hope I got the story?
I don't publish it if I'm not sure. That's one way I've avoided arrest. Another one too is, so I don't guess. I don't do guesswork.
Right.
I really don't do that kind of journalism. But I would say that one of the things I try to do is always to include the subtext. So let's say you do a story on people are upset that some subsidies were removed in some kind of Gulf country. I think it's also very important to mention a lot of the benefits maybe that are in that country as well, compared to, because in America, what do we have? I mean, it's debatable. So, it's important, I think, just to always include, let's say there's a decision, in one of the Gulf countries to crack down hard on a certain issue. I try to understand why. What's the political rationale? Not a justification, the rationale, the reasoning behind it.
Right.
And I think if it's a smart piece of journalism, I would say the governments can at least respect it.
Thank you. Ryan, I want to take you into fantasy land right now, all right? How would the media landscape in the United States look if it did not have the mega corporations, the giant Fox News, the giant MSNBCs? How would that impact independent journalism? And what stories then would it be different as to what stories would be prioritized?
The real effect of these partisan news outlets, MSNBC and Fox News, and their linkage to their respective parties, Democrats and Republicans, is to really narrow what a broad audience is willing to hear. And that on the left is new, and on the right it's a little less new, because I think Fox was 10, 15 years ahead of MSNBC on this front. 20 years ago, there was a robust kind of intra-left coalition debate going on about all sorts of things, from the center to the far left, debating about war, foreign policy, surveillance policy, welfare policy, social policies, cultural issues. like that, there was an accepted level of dissent and discourse. That has been shrunken dramatically now by whatever the New York Times and MSNBC are saying. Like that's the proscription around it, and that comes from the hyperpolarization, where Democrats believe that everything is zero sum with a dictatorship, that if this guy wins, this is the last election we'll ever have, and therefore debating these issues is a threat to democracy itself, which you can see how circular that is. They're throwing democracy out in order to save it.
Right. It's, I covered both conventions, the Republican convention and the Democrat convention this summer, and it was fascinating to watch because the delegates you have that go to these are hardcore believers. They are absolutely either, they may or may not love Trump, but they adhere to the Republican way of thinking, vice versa. When we were in Chicago, the Democrats passionately believe everything that was going there. But to your point was then the other side was just evil. The other side, whatever the other side believed was not just different, it was evil. It had evil intent, and they both passionately, honestly, in their heart and soul, believe that.
Yeah,
and I can tell you, having been at both of them, most of the people at those were not evil on either side. They were just people that believed something, but they really thought the other side was evil. And I think that's the danger here.
Yeah, I focused on Democrats, but it's very true for Republicans as well.
Yeah.
You have, Elon Musk every day amplifying himself, saying that if Democrats win, this will be the last election ever.
Yeah,
So
terrible,
both sides
terrible.
believe that this election will be the last election.
Just very quickly, the last part of that question was, what would be different if there were not those major outlets, if there were just independent journalists? Would there be different priorities as to what was being covered, do you think?
I mean, it depends on. I think because it's the hyperpolarization that drives it, that if you'd have to take that out of the equation as well for it to be different, and perhaps that you could without those monomedia forms. But I don't think so necessarily, because every other kind of developed nation has the same hyperpolarization going on, and they have. Although, if you look at countries that have a Murdoch media empire versus ones without a Murdoch media empire, you actually see a lot less of that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Marc, we keep talking, going back to disinformation, misinformation, but in both of those, whether it's by error or by intent, it's information that's going out to the public that is untrue. Yeah. What's the basis on which news is labeled? How do we break that down? How can you tell? As a casual viewer or a casual reader, how can you, are there telltale signs that maybe something isn't quite right or something isn't quite accurate?
Well, I mean, it depends on the context, but often you get told be suspicious of something that makes you emotional, extra emotional, because it might be clickbait or rage bait, and therefore it might be false. But much of the time, one doesn't know. I mean, you said you were at the Conservative Party conference, right? Were you at CPAC?
I was at CPAC.
Okay, right. But okay.
But
CPAC.
Republican, Democrat, I was also go attend CPAC, yeah.
But just as an interesting example, so I've spent the past 6 months with a colleague working on a big investigation into this massive disinformation campaign. And someone paid to have a video about Qatar at CPAC. I don't know if you saw it, if you were there. It was
I did not see that.
It was ahead of Trump's speech, right? It was a video played. It was advertising a website called Shame Qatar, and it was about Qatar's role in apparently not allowing the hostages, supporting Hamas, supporting terror, right? It was very blockade 2017. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't said who provided that. We later linked this to a massive multi-million-dollar operation that was running billboards in Times Square. It was running billboards in Beirut. It was running Facebook ads targeting the US and Europe, right? And what it goes to show is that most people who would be exposed to, for example, a Facebook ad about, it was about many different things. It was also very anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, but also anti-Qatar. They would have no idea that this was fake. Unless, for example, they saw this and they go, this looks really sketchy, which some people do. Some people look at stuff and they go, this is sketchy. But for the most part, we often rely on other elements to try and help us identify that. Like now on X, it's this community notes things, which is hopeless because it's just become a sparring ground for people with different opinions. Facebook might take something down, but they might not. They say we label some things AI, so you know it's manipulated. But in the case of the investigation where there was lots of AI-generated images, it didn't detect them as AI, right? So often the solutions are outsourced. They say, well, outsource this identification to AI. So we'll try and use tech to solve a problem created by tech, which is always a disaster. So the short answer is no, we can't. And often, depending on the particular situation, there's not one silver bullet that would enable us to identify disinformation. Some it would come more, it needs to be more judicious use by social media companies of labeling, having stricter criteria. I mean, firstly, much of this shouldn't be exposed to the public. And to go back to that campaign I just mentioned, imagine this, you take, as Facebook did or Meta did, at least $1.2 million to run ads targeting Muslims across the world, and in this case Qatar, and you don't know who's paying you. This was what happened. They attributed it to Vietnam. Vietnam was just where the operation was run. So social media companies, for example, shouldn't be allowed to run ads that are with fake news, making money from them, and not even knowing who they're getting money from. So, that is just one example of a situation where, social media companies would be failing in their duty, for example, to provide us good information. We shouldn't all expect that all of this should be down on the individual to be able to curate this massive tide of information we're getting, and every individual suddenly becomes a fact checker, dedicating their whole time to saying, is this false? It's unreasonable. So, short answer, no. There's no silver bullet, right? But if it makes you emotional,
Use your intuition.
if it makes you emotional, then be suspicious.
Do what you
Have
can.
no emotions. That's the trick, right?
Be emotion free. It's funny, a couple of just thoughts as we conclude, and that is going back to the very first comments when you were saying some of the things we miss in the media now is a friendly media. And I wrote a piece like a year, maybe 2 years ago, on Oman. Beautiful place, great place to go. And it was just, the headline in the Washington Times was vacation in the Middle East. Now, the average American, to Aya's point, thinks very homogenous. Oh, Middle East, that's a tough place, that's a bad neighborhood. And so I have a friend of mine from college, a guy I've known for 40 years, that tends to be conservative, but is very well educated, really bright guy, very successful in the world. And he sends me a note, and he says, what are you, crazy? I would never vacation in the Middle East. And I said, did you read? Clearly, he did not. But I said, did you actually read the article? Did you read the column? Because if you read about Oman, about where it is, and about what's there, and what's offered, you would think, oh my gosh, what a great place. But all he saw were those words, Middle East, and he tuned it out. And so sometimes we've set these columns in place where people have predisposed notions that they never get beyond the headline. I think us as consumers of news have to not only to figure out what it is that has been said, whether that's accurate or not, but you've got to read it. You've got to or absorb it. If you're watching on video format or listening in a podcast, you've got to actually hear the whole thing instead of just hearing a sliver or reading the headline and then determining what you think before you get into the substance. And so I think as journalists, we've got a responsibility to put good information out, but as consumers of journalism, we've got a responsibility to read it or watch it in its entirety and then try to decipher what we like and what we don't like.
Yes, but headlines also are the first impact with the reader. Like, for example, the Post had a headline, Russia invades Ukraine. Great, it did Ukraine. Israelis move into Lebanon. It's the difference. They just went for a picnic or to watch a football match. So I agree with you, but you can't put the onus on the reader. It's also the people, by an act of commission or omission, they put these headlines, and I think it's important that we have honest journalists, which is very difficult to find.
And sadly, 7 out of 10 people don't think the media is being honest. So,
I agree with you.
ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.